We can start.
Yeah. Prof, are you ready to share your screen?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, let's do that.
So good evening, viewers and friends of MIT. Welcome to our final webinar of 2020, anchored by one of our own, Professor Eugene Fitzgerald, CEO and Director of SMART. I think many of you are aware of Eugene and the impactful that he and his team in SMART is doing in integrating research, innovation, and entrepreneurship in Singapore. My name is Ching Su, Vice President of the MIT Club of Singapore. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Eugene. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Ching Su. So first of all, can you all see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Oh, great. All right. It doesn't have the usual box around it. That's kind of interesting. Okay.
Yeah, but before you start, Eugene, would be awesome if you could provide a bit of summary on your colorful and impressive background. And please let us know, how did you end up in Singapore?
Yeah, so I actually have that on sort of the fourth slide in, because you had wanted me to talk about that. So, but a brief version of that is that I came here in 1998 because of the original Singapore MIT alliance. Not surprisingly, I was a U.S. person that when I went to a cocktail party to hear about this new program that I was invited to. And there was this short guy with these huge glasses named Tony Tan. He had come personally to kind of start this program, which is interesting, right? Because it shows you the kind of corporate thing where even though you're high level, sometimes you go down to different levels to activate things and make sure things start properly. So he was very hands-on at the beginning, and of course I had no idea where Singapore was, honestly, at that time. Yeah, the rest is history. So I'll go over that a little bit later, but I was drawn more and more in, both because of, I make a high level summary. I think that the progression in what I was interested in and the way that I was thinking about innovation and commercialization was in sync with Singapore, actually. So it was exciting to be able to contribute to, to Singapore, going through those phases here with MIT. So that's how I got involved. So I'll go through a little bit more to show you how those interests did evolve and kind of in parallel with Singapore a little bit later in the presentation. So Ching Su, after the, I think it was after the Business Times article, asked me to talk about this topic, and then also a little bit on the personal journey as well. So that's what I put together here. I think an important thing to think about, I mean, Singapore's thinking about this more than most places in the world. I think most places in the world are still thinking, I got to dump some money into R&D, something magical will happen, and then we'll be like the Bay Area, right? And of course, Singapore's moved way beyond that because they started doing that 20 years ago. But it's actually unknown, right? So one of the exciting things here is we're breaking new ground in how to think about this. And part of it is done here now in SMART. So it's a very exciting thing. And we've just, the last couple of years, moved in some new directions, thinking about that for these long-term research programs in conjunction with Singapore government. So I'm excited to talk about that with you today. So one of the things I do now that I'm in charge of all of SMART is that I have 2 masters. I have to be telling Singapore why this is important for Singapore, but people forget I have to be telling MIT why it's important for MIT to be halfway around the world, right? So I just had to give a presentation to CREATE's governing council. So CREATE is the building you see behind me. This is across the AYE from NUS. It's where we live, and MIT was the SMART was the beginning of Create. But of course, now Singapore's invited other universities into this space. So we have Cambridge University, ETH from Switzerland, a whole set of different partners. They're not as large as the MIT program. I'm proud to say we're still 50% at Create, which is great. But I think, the goal of Singapore is to erode our position in that over time, not necessarily by decreasing our activity, but of course, inviting more and having more research activity there. So this slide really describes, as we move forward, why it's unique to MIT's ecosystem. And it's this integration, that having a place where you can have an innovation center and you can think about the whole process from beginning of research all the way to entrepreneurship is really a unique thing in the MIT system. In a way, MIT is kind of a disorganized version of that, right? There's thousands of things going on. You guys all know this. You've been there. It's 1,000 points of light, but you can't really point to it and say exactly what's going on here. So here we're much smaller, but we can be more focused and thinking about this. So it is this integration in one place. Even within Singapore, it's unique, of having people come together to do this sort of research at an early stage, try to have innovation process operate and have company formation on the other side. So one of the, again, unique features is that we have an innovation center within SMART, which I'm sure some of you have interacted. You probably know Howard Califano. He's been leading that for a long time and has deep connections throughout the Singapore ecosystem. But basically, it's like a little funding within our own system, so that at the end we can start to stimulate startup formation, still on the public side though, little grants to try to help them think about the right things and start to reach escape velocity out of SMART at least. And Singapore government, I don't know if you know, has created a new thing called central gap funding, which is larger funding now to help move deep tech even further along in order to transition, because as we know, the Singapore venture side is still, let's say, a little conservative. It's changing, but it's still a little conservative. So for more things that aren't immediately market ready, there still needs to be a little help there. And also, we've done some new things actually to form these larger programs right at the beginning, which is a really unique thing. Is if you think about other factors up front when you form these large programs, can we form them in a way that there's kind of obvious blind alleys that you want to eliminate right away? So instead of doing research for 5 years and finding them, we see a lot of times you can find them up front. So we started this process to actually even have the original research project pointed in a direction that has a higher chance for outcome. So that's the really leading edge of this kind of integrated RIE. Feature of this is large collaborative projects, meaning that you can't just have MIT people, they have to be collaborating with people in the Singapore ecosystem. So NUS, NTU, any of the institutes, really almost anybody, because as we've had more biotech programs, we're interfacing to all sorts of institutions in Singapore. We could build infrastructure for purpose. That may seem obvious in Singapore, but as you might remember, in MIT, kind of any infrastructure is impossible to put on research contracts, but also to do it in a coordinated way with some sort of integrated RIE can't exist at all. So I think that's when MIT looks at Singapore and SMART, they say, wow, we can do things here that we can't do back at the home institution. We have a great international program, SMERF, which is giving MIT undergraduates a chance to participate over the summer. Of course, not last year, or this past year, but it's actually now one of the more popular programs, creating Singapore MIT student connections right from the very beginning when they're undergraduates. And of course, one of the other advantages is that SMART has been the highest productivity research place at MIT over the last year. So it turns out that because of the way Singapore handled the ramp down and ramp up, our research activities here slowed a little bit, but not much actually, where MIT went through a very hard lockdown over a much longer period of time. And so our faculty have been saying, wow, it's really great that I participate in SMART because our team over there was able to keep moving. So it really kind of starting to identify and enunciate better exactly why SMART's a special place, both in Singapore and at MIT. I'm just going to mention these programs because we have a lot more to talk about, but in each one of these programs, you can see they could be in all different areas. The antimicrobial resistance program was ahead of the curve because worrying about things like infectious disease, bacteria, and pathogens before COVID hits. Of course, they had special projects granted to them during the COVID. And CAMP is a new program, which is manufacturing for stem cells. And that became a national program. So the first time a SMART program, which is already integrated with Singapore, but then in addition, they took two A-star programs, put them together, and that's the entire funding for this area in Singapore. So SMART's playing a major role in that. Agricultural program, which is kind of small, but it's going to probably increase in size, and it was way ahead of the curve as well. This was formed before it was popular, before the Singapore Food Agency was around. So again, we're ahead of the curve on that one. Future mobility, you guys might remember, everybody thought when that was started 10 years ago, we were crazy. It was before anyone thought autonomous vehicles was an interesting thing, believe it or not. And so that's another thing. That program is winding down now. And then there's my own program in microelectronics where we said, let's build these chips that are going to be of value in the future. And it's not going to be driven by computation and memory, which is of course driven silicon up to this point, right? So really we've been consistently ahead of the curve, which is very, very exciting. This is the part that Ching-Su, this is the slide of how my interest in Singapore grew. A little bit about my background. This is you can tell one consequence of innovation is the loss of hair. It's very, very serious. So this is me in high school. Can you believe it? And it's funny. It's just a coincidence. I was going to put this in here, but my sister was going through some things online and found how somebody had digitized some of our high school stuff. And you know, you can notice the 70s, you got the wide lapel with these huge knots, right? So there I was, so excited to go to MIT. And I only had two interests in my whole life before that. Basically science and technology. I was the kid with the chemistry set and the electronics set and all that. And basketball, that was it. Those are the only two things I was interested in. So STAR means interested in, right? But when I went to MIT, I chose material science and engineering because I'm interested in a broad array of things. I didn't want to have to choose one. So, you know, physics, chemistry, electrical engineering, all that. I didn't want to have to choose one. And I thought that was a good combination. So I really went to MIT to understand more because of that work I had done in the basement of our home back in East Longmeadow. I knew I didn't know enough, and I wanted to understand what was going on. Especially, I was always interested in the materials or like inside the chips. You know, I started to play with the early integrated circuits, that I wanted to know, well, what's inside there, and you couldn't read about it in anything that I had. So I went to MIT for that. But the other thing I want to point out is I went there for employment because I was from a modest family. And so basically all I was excited about was, hey, all I got to do is get C's, graduate from MIT, and I'll have a job, right? That's really how I went to MIT, actually, right? So I did not go there. This is why I think, you know, it's so different today. I didn't go to MIT thinking, oh, I got the best test scores, I'm going to be like an amazing person. Actually, it was completely the opposite, right? So, but then my junior year, one of the professors said, you ought to think about grad school, because it was this quantum materials course. And I really liked it, and it seemed interesting to me. And so actually I chose to go to Cornell for graduate school because it's more science-based. At that time, MIT and material science department, very engineering-based, which is fantastic. But I wanted to go deeper again, understand some of the science behind that. And Cornell was known, I mean, if you guys don't know, it's in the middle of nowhere in New York State. And, you know, people sit around in the summer, these beautiful lakes, and think deep thoughts and stuff like that. So, so I wanted to go deeper into the science-based material science. And so that was that. And then I had a dream. I just had always had this irrational dream I wanted to go to an industrial lab where you could do something important. I wanted to be the guy wearing the white coat. You do something important, and then, amazing commercialization happens through that company. This is the beginning of the reason I say this is the beginning of commercialization interest is that we discovered something really important. It's called strained silicon, which some of you know that, we were involved in the early days, and eventually I created a company at MIT to commercialize that. Here, once we discovered it, I found out that actually there was no process to move the idea from Bell Labs to the marketplace, which shocked me because I thought, why am I here if that's not in existence, right? So that was the beginning of my my curious sort of involvement with, well, if we're doing research, how the heck does it impact anything, right? So as the American ecosystem devolved from large corporate labs into something else, it turns out those discoveries are so important that a lot of universities were interested. So I was only interested in MIT because I wasn't sure I wanted to be a professor, but at MIT, I could both see if I liked doing that, but also I knew that I could try to start enterprise. And that would finish my curiosity about how does this work. And so that's why I put entrepreneurship here, my growing interest. Well, if it doesn't happen through big companies, it must happen through small companies, right? So, and then in the middle of all that, Tony Tan shows up and creates Singapore MIT Alliance. And so I started saying, I don't really know, but there's a few things that I knew. One was that I knew that my interest area, semiconductors, was all in Asia. And I also knew that that it was likely that innovation was going to be a global activity. And really, I joined the SMA just while I was asked to, and it looked like a good opportunity. But also, I felt that I needed to just be there and understand what's halfway around the world, basically. That's really why I did it. And so the rest is history. Lots of great collaborations. We did early, people don't realize SMA was involved in early asynchronous and synchronous education online. So a lot of firsts in this program that I think haven't been communicated outside. But then when SMART appeared, which is the physical lab I was talking about over here, we proposed LEES, which is low energy electronic system. So it's kind of looking past Moore's law, saying in 10 years, how are people going to make chips that matter? What kind of chips are going to matter? Because computing and memory are likely to be pretty mature. So that over time, really was about setting up something here so we could create a new Intel, and to think about, can we create a new Intel in Singapore? And so the success of that program actually, and the fact that this was working out, and so right now we're doing this, and I needed to spend more time in Singapore, plus innovation process. So it turns out Singapore is asking MIT to kind of look a little bit further. And so by becoming Smart CEO, now we could kind of execute on this bigger vision about how research connects to commercialization. So 6 enterprises that I've founded or co-founded, with the new one called New Silicon here in Singapore. And I want to say that MIT opened the door, but my lasting relationships in all this, especially globally and in Singapore, really were created by entrepreneurship. It's kind of a one story is Ken Lee, who's my you could think of him as the CTO of Smart Lees, more or less. He, I met him because my first company doing the strained silicon, it turns out that Ken's dad actually got to know some people that were investing in my company. And so while I was in Singapore, he got me there. He said, "Oh, my son's been accepted to MIT. Why don't you meet with him?" So I met with him, and he was really interested in integrated optics on silicon, which is really funny because that's where he ended up in the company, actually. So, and he got his PhD with me. He came back. He worked with DSO like Alvin's doing, but then went to the program management side. And and it turns out that Fayez was an early guy in Android, because when I had a small R&D thing here as far back as 2001, and we hired him out of Chartered, and he's an NTU grad. And it turns out, make a long story short, I recruited him. He was back at Global Foundries years later. And so when I was doing Smart Leads, I said, hey, we're going to need someone that understands all the interdisciplinary stuff you do. So I brought him in, and he introduced me to Keith Eng, who became my program manager, who was also from Global Foundries. So my point is that was all through the entrepreneurial aspect, even though the door is opened by MIT. So I think those two combinations are very, very powerful to do all this stuff. So a little bit on why the last couple of years, both Singapore and Smart has been interested in thinking about research to commercialization. So there's still, everybody follows the linear model, right? Which is, I do R&D, something from R&D must be interesting, and then eventually, we try to manufacture it, and there must be customers. And of course, if you really think about this model, it requires clairvoyancy, right? And that's why I've got this picture over here. It requires the people that start this project. If you look at the way we do KPIs and research, it requires you to say 10, 15 years ahead of time, I know what's going to happen in the future. Now, clearly, we shouldn't be doing this process because we're lying, right? Now, this is where, normally I would say, yes, MIT professors are geniuses. They actually can predict the future. And so, but I'm being honest here that is really not possible. So, by the way, another sideline, if you believe that philosophy, what nobody understands, all the systems that we put in place demand that scientists are the best investors, which questions why are they doing science then, right? Because they can predict the future. It's kind of a confusing kind of thing, right? So, it really sets up it actually makes you go down a path predefined, which is impossible to predict, which means that outcome is going to be low. And that's what the world is seeing. If you look at R&D efficiency across the globe over the last 30 years, it's become less and less efficient. In fact, productivity is not scaling with R&D investment at all. So since we can't predict the future, something else must have been going on from the beginning of man, because clearly we've been advancing, right? So, so what we started realizing was that more thinking about process. What is it that we're actually doing that gets us there? Because we can't know ahead of time. So how do we meander over time to arrive at the right place? And it tells you that we're not focusing on process, that we're so consumed with measuring outcome along the way that we're distorting the process to get outcome measurement, as opposed to letting innovation process actually happen, which delivers value that mankind has been doing for a long time. So this has been where our real shift that occurred about 15, 20 years ago. So, just to do a very high level view of this, if you think about a final innovation marketplace, you need a market application. Some set of technologies, remember that we're using technology in a generic way. So this could be science, could be, a piece of technology you just made, or an older piece of technology. Just all the collection of all that together is called technology. And implementation is how you actually bring these two together in the market, which everybody forgets about. But for those of you who've done enterprises, of course, it's like the key thing, right? Because you have to have a business model. You have to understand how the industry operates. Where are you playing in the industry? What about the supply chain, the value chain? This is actually all this stuff in here that has to somehow have this at the end of the day, deliver the technology to the market in a profitable way, which is something we've forgotten, because with money printing everywhere, we have figured out that innovation assets can be overpriced as well. So we really don't need to make money. But I'm assuming that's all going to end pretty soon. And especially for Singapore, you better have some real stuff at the end, right? So here's the model that we've been kind of doing, the linear model. and for long-term R&D, which is over 10 years, right? So you say, well, I have some market application that we think is important today. So you say, this is like the most important thing. So we start the R&D machine and we have people work in this box, right? This dash box. We say, we're going to work on this. And then at the end of that, we start thinking, okay, now it's time to bring it to that market we thought about 10 years ago. And, we haven't really been thinking about this, but some problems, like there's no business model available in industries we're looking at. The price is like 10 times too high, and things like that, right? So we try to run back and go back to the beginning. Now, this is a huge challenge. So that we started the Smart Innovation Center, that's what it was doing in the Singapore ecosystem, because not only for SMART programs, but also for the Singapore ecosystem, we can serve NUS or NTU or any other place, right? So we were never just about taking and giving grants to only SMART. We actually give it to all the CREATE system as well as outside. So, they have to be R&D projects that have been funded by Singapore government, things like that. So the challenge here that Howard started seeing initially back in 2010 was that, well, a lot of these things doesn't necessarily have any value once you started thinking about implementation and market. So what they did was they started reaching upstream further. They started realizing, let's have some courses and things that help people back here inside the box start learning about that these factors are important, and maybe while they're doing the technology, we could still get them a little bit earlier. And of course, what I just described is the completion of that cycle with the work that we were doing, that now we're bringing this all the way back to even the beginning of program formation. And so what does that look like? So that looks like this, where right from the beginning, if I have a 10-year project, you don't know exactly what's going on, but you do what we call innovation mapping at the beginning, where you say, look, there's a range of market applications. We don't know which exact market. We kind of know what it could do, and there's a zillion of things if you've picked a correct topic for 10-year investment. Then you say, well, there's a bunch of unknowns and a bunch of knowns, and there's all this technology and science. And then, the industry looks a particular way today. It might not look that way tomorrow, but, this is how it works. And you can imagine, all right, well, if something comes out of here, maybe it could work. And these things all influence each other, and you think about them all the time, even though you're working on technology and research that's further defining what can be there. It's decreasing uncertainty over time because of investment over here, which then tells you which markets innovation go for. And of course, this all affects your research, actually. This is the big thing that people haven't realized. So you don't have to predict the future, because what you're doing is in constant little iterative feedback loops, and that everything in the outside world is changing. But what happens is you can meander over time, and you actually find that value in the future. It's not predetermined. It's that you find it over time. So this thing converges over a long period of time if you're managing it properly. And then, of course, innovation in the marketplace is specific markets, specific set of technologies with specific implementation. And as I said, that we've added that recently, this beginning part of how you map this out for large research programs. We've just started doing this, and it's helped create larger programs. So now they're very interested, the Singapore government's interested in how we can use this to help, the formation of these larger projects. So right from the beginning, you kind of identify blind alleys and things like that. So now you see the difference, right? Is that the research process, or the innovation process, we prefer to call it, even 10 years in advance, is everything in this, dashed box. So in our particular Smart Leads area, without going into too much detail, what you're looking at here is a technology that everybody, first of all, didn't think was going to be important 10 years ago, and also probably still thinks it's not possible, right? So how could we be here? And the answer is, again, I could tell you we're brilliant and we could predict the future, but I would be lying. So what we actually did was say, look, CMOS is running out of steam, right? Tons of markets, if you can make silicon do new things. How do you make it do new things? Well, there's these materials called 3,5s. In this case, this material up here called gallium nitride. It turns out they're high performance semiconductors, but only in particular kinds of things like emitting light or projecting a lot of wireless power. And people would prefer these. So if you look up, if you open up many systems, whether it's an internet switch or a wireless system or your cell phone, you'll find actually tons of 3.5 devices in there, right? So it kind of gives you that long-term capability that I was mentioning, which is that, if you think about doing this, if we could put these materials into silicon, there's a wide range of markets that we could impact. So I don't have to worry about picking the right one, because if I can get any of these compounds, the chances are I'll hit something, right? And so that's how we started. And we looked at different 3.5 materials, and we kept talking to outside companies in these different fields to look at as we got research results. And we, of course, incorporated how we'd be manufacturing this. That's why we're able to do this on a 200 millimeter wafer, which is kind of a little bit of trailing edge silicon technology, but that's where we've basically proven that's where all new innovation will enter in the semiconductor field. So, so we were able to just give you an idea. Everybody thought 10 years ago that power electronics would be the first area where this technology might enter. And then people thought wireless would be kind of after that. And then last would be some sort of maybe optoelectronic thing like LEDs or something, but that's white space. Silicon could never do that before. So everybody anticipated that would be longer term. And it turns out that that sequence, by the time we finished, because we left it as a variable, inverted. So it turns out this one that was white space that everybody thought was impossible is under huge demand now for not only smart lighting applications in a range of different end markets, but also the one that is really driving this, or the companies trying to AR, VR displays that aren't clunky, basically. So you need to have essentially a single chip to both reach the price point and the performance that people really want in those systems. So that again, you couldn't have predicted 10 years ago. It's really kind of cool if you think about silicon. Silicon has a layer of transistors here, and then it has this metallization in the back end that connects all the transistors. That's what's made silicon so powerful. Without going into a lot of details, what we've been able to do is magically insert a 3.5 layer in here, and then use the same kind of interconnect technology available in manufacturing to come down and connect to the 3.5 devices. So, much of the world thinks this is science fiction still, even though we announced this last year, but it's very exciting and has really put us here in Singapore on a leading edge. We had announced this manufacturing process once we got line yield, so that we have this moved into real fabs. And so we got picked up by a lot of press here, including Bloomberg. So, in the current world, I guess if you make Bloomberg, then it means something. Still have to have the chips for it though. But it was kind of cool. Got on here, and I was here, and they were in Hong Kong, and so it was pretty exciting times. Now, during this whole process, the key thing is managing uncertainty. I want to say a few words about the difference between managing uncertainty and managing risk, because this is the huge error that we're all doing. So, risk is sort of, I know what I don't know. So in other words, by looking at the past, you can kind of see how things work. And you say, you know what, I don't really know about this thing over here. And so you understand your risk. So in other words, the way to think about risk is that I have data sets that tell me where the things are that I don't know about, right? And so I could do a calculation in general, and people like to work as humans. We like to work actually, this is why people talk about risk is, entrepreneurship is risk. It's actually not, right? That says that you might as well go to the Sands Casino and just gamble there, because it's the same, right? You actually know what the numbers are, right? You go into the casino, you know what the house odds are, but people try to have it end up that, hey, if I put money down, it just happens to be that way, right? And so people think that venture and everything else, it's actually not that. if you think about this process where I said you purposely need to leave uncertainty into market, implementation, and technology at the beginning, otherwise you can't find new space, right? Then what you realize is that at the beginning of that process, I don't know what to know. I have to try to figure out what are the most important things to know as I move forward. This is actually where you get new innovation from, drastically new innovation, and it's difficult for the majority of people to do, and it's actually how you get high yield. This is the thing that people miss. They think, if you look, many venture funds are trying to do this, when actually it's way too early. You got to go further out and do this, and that's how you get high return. So this all comes back to MIT. I'm going to ask Alvin, who's this guy? Because you took my class, so you should tell everybody, who's that guy, Alvin?
Vannevar Bush.
There you go. So Vannevar Bush, you guys might remember Building 13. Anybody remember Building 13? It's the Vannevar Bush building, if you didn't know that, because MIT, we all go by numbers, as you know. So, you know, he wrote that famous treatise saying the endless frontier, which is that nation states should invest in R&D because the yield is tremendous for society, for your country, right? So, and remember, he did that, and he started in the 1930s, convinced Roosevelt. It won the war, essentially, because all those programs he had started, the most famous one is Manhattan Project, but it turns out there's zillions of them. And then afterwards, he said it was going to be great for commerce. And so it's a very MIT history here of why the nation state invests in R&D. And what's interesting is if you look at how he defines engineering. So the engineer was not primarily a physicist or a businessman or an inventor, but someone who would acquire some of the skills and knowledge of each of these and be capable of successfully developing and applying new devices on a grand scale, right? So, you know, I don't think anybody would argue that's how we teach today, right? We're not trying to have an undergraduate be a physicist, a businessman, and an inventor at the same time, but we should be, right? So we are moving in this direction, but it is interesting to note that today we have to call this an innovator, but actually historically it's an engineer, right? And that's what MIT is about. So just a final slide here, thinking about Singapore now is I'm excited about Singapore ecosystem because I think we're close to having what's really rare in the world. So of course it's in the US, but if you look around the world, there's not many places that can have this process that I'm talking about work. And, you know, I was involved, and you might remember MIT got involved with there was the Skoltech program in Russia. There was the Masdar Institute in UAE. It turns out I was involved in those, right? So that really brought this home to me that actually, you know, Singapore is in a really unique position, and it's because innovation has to be driven by hopeful individuals that excite small groups of people that get together and just have an enormous vision for what they could accomplish. It has to be accommodated by society's ecosystem. Now, what I mean by accommodated is that nobody ever wants innovation. So every story, all of my stories are people resisting this, and they're going to resist hard. But if you have an environment that allows it to enter, even though nobody really wants it, then that's a chance. And of course, the thing is real market forces, which the US has temporarily lost this, but it'll come back. But you know, I think Singapore is a place that definitely that you can see this starting to happen here. So it's very exciting. So I'll stop there and answer any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you, Gene. Shiva, I think you have a question.
Oh yeah, hi. Hi, Gene. Shiva, MIT alum, Sloan, 06. Thank you. It was a very insightful presentation. One of the questions I had is, do you have some sort of like an equation or some sort of a empirical model whereby you can predict the uncertainty and risk I mean, I thought that was a very interesting theory that you had. And I look at startups and investment opportunities daily, so I think this would be very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing is we're applying it in Smart because we have 5 to 10 year timelines, right? So what we hope actually, and it's already started because, for example, we've had companies come out of Smart. We have a great track record. We're just formalizing a little bit, and now, if you're an investor, the trick is, can you work with places where you can go back further in the pipeline, right? Go upstream. This is one of the things that I think, investors waiting at the end, it's extremely difficult because you can't change anything. So, you always change what you can, right? You say, I got management team, I got technology, I think the market wants this or whatever, but you're still in a channel that you can't get out of because, unless you want to spend a lot of money, you can't pivot a lot, right? And pivoting is essentially dealing with uncertainty, right? So I'm arguing, the whole thing should be uncertainty process. You keep on pivoting, so at the end, you have a much more investable company to come out. Now, in that earlier process, you cannot predict the future, of course, because it's a multivariable space where things in the outside world are always changing, including markets and technology and implementation, right? However, what it does do is it involves constant input into the team so that you migrate over time to arrive at something that has a higher chance of having impact, right? So you'll never be able to, because it's process-based and not outcome-based, that's why at the end you can have higher outcomes, right? But while you're doing it, if you make it outcome-based, you fall back to the KPIs, which means that you destroy your chance of impacting the future, essentially. Now, the process, so what you come to the conclusion is, can you measure the process while you're doing it? And that's actually part of the new RI 2025 program that we have in SMART, which is to say, can we develop software so that as we have these long-term research projects, we can measure, essentially, it's a long story, but we're trying to measure the reduction of uncertainty, right? Because that's actually what's happening. And then you can measure progress that way. So you're not determining what you have to achieve. You're just determining, have you reduced uncertainty and found a path? Because, of course, if you end up where you can't find any path, you shut the project down. And that's something that you can do in SMART, but it's very difficult to do in traditional university research because the students have to graduate, right?
Right.
So, yeah. So I think there's several ways that SMART can really achieve this. And so the answer is that at the end, there's not really much you can do. What you have to hope is that you have more and more places like SMART that can do this kind of thing. We're developing tools to try to help others to do it. And I think that's what the Singapore government would like, is that as we develop these things, they can be deployed at other places throughout Singapore. And, we become more efficient at innovation and give greater, the things coming out of SMART and then later other places will be higher yielding, right? Because imagine if you invest in something, but you have, 7 years, 8 years of data explaining why they converged over here. I think if you saw that, it might be a little bit easier for you to understand, all right, here's how my connections and how my money can really, bring this to fruition, right? Right now, you have nothing. You have to listen to people, and then you have to do what you can with limited resource to try to map out the space. But, understanding that history and how they got there would be super important to investment, right? So,
Yep.
So that, all I could say is we're not there yet, but I'm thinking we might have some tools within 3 to 4 years. So, hopefully we can do it fast enough that you're still investing at that time.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Hello, Gene. This is Francis Yo. I just thought listen in to see how smart has been after all these years.
Hey,
how are you?
How are you doing?
How are you doing? Fine. Yeah.
Hey, great. I like your Christmas tree.
Yeah. So a couple of questions. I think when we started Smart 10 years ago now, right? I think a lot of emphasis was made on the MIT model of spinning out companies from research. I think that was one of the key things that we were focusing on. So it's been 10 years now. Can you share how much of that spin-off startup kind of things happened over this period? How many companies came out of research that was done at Smart? Right. So
Yeah,
that's one question. Can I just
maybe
I've got another question, but maybe I'll stop here.
Yeah, so it turns out that we didn't have any resources for collecting the data for the longest time, but as we're building up towards this next phase of Smart Innovation Center this year, we finally were able to go out and get that data. And so we just wrote a report that was submitted to the Singapore government, which is one of the things behind the Innovation Center renewal that's coming up. And so I think there was something like we were able to track down 45 companies that came out of the Smart Innovation Center, and they also collected statistics on how much subsequent funding they were able to raise, and it's really good. It's really significant. In fact, I mean, I don't have the comparison, with other things in Singapore, but I'm pretty sure it's probably leading edge, right? So they looked at 45 companies, and I think 2/3 of them are still around, and like a third have just raised a lot of capital and things like that. So now I would say that the highest, this is kind of interesting data, the highest M&A transactions are all from Smart programs. So meaning that, remember I told you the Innovation Center can work with the ecosystem to help not just Smart research, but other research as well. And the really big M&A transactions, which I think are about $1 billion or something like that. Yeah, about $1 billion are from Smart projects. And I think that's because of this collaborative nature, right? That you're starting things 10 years ahead of time. You have MIT people combined with NUS, NTU, and you're in a different environment. You're in an environment that focuses on innovation with outcome. And so I think that's probably why, obviously you're trying to formalize that and make that more efficient, but it's pretty exciting that was the case, that the highest M&A.
How many of those 45 actually comes from research that's carried out at Smart? Because I know the Innovation Center sort of serves other work, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't have that off the top of my head, but like I said, the MIT ones tend to be fewer but bigger M&A, where I think the collecting from all in the ecosystem, you tend to have lots of numbers, but they tend to be still around or raising money, but not as big in sort of M&A. That's what I think
Newtonomy is one of those, right?
Newtonomy is one of the MIT ones. That's correct. Yes.
Okay.